Take a moment and look around. Every city, every family, every child laughing, every person waking up this morning with plans for a future they cannot yet see. None of us arrived here alone. Behind every living human being is an unbroken chain of generations stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. Generation after generation survived long enough to become someone else's ancestor, and eventually they became ours. Homo sapiens has existed for roughly 300,000 years. That sounds like an almost unimaginable span of time, but compared with the age of Earth, it is only a moment, and within that moment, our species has survived enormous changes. Changing climates, shifting landscapes, migration, competition, disease, scarcity, and countless events whose details have been lost forever. But there is one question that has fascinated scientists for decades. Was there ever a moment when that chain of survival came dangerously close to breaking? One proposed answer points to a place in what is now Indonesia, to a volcano, to an eruption so enormous that its geological signature can still be found thousands of kilometers away, and to a theory that once suggested something extraordinary, that this single eruption may have brought humanity close to extinction. But this is not simply a story about a volcano. It is a story about how scientists reconstruct a disaster that happened tens of thousands of years ago, how they test an explanation, and what happens when the evidence refuses to cooperate. Because sometimes, the most fascinating scientific stories begin when the obvious answer starts to fall apart. Forget the image of prehistoric humans as simple figures wandering helplessly through a dangerous world. The people alive 74,000 years ago were not waiting for history to begin. They were already living it. They raised children. They cared for relatives. They searched for food. They made tools. They learned from one another. They occupied different landscapes and responded to the environments around them. They were not identical copies of one another. They were communities, groups, families, individuals, and they lived in a world that could provide abundance one season and scarcity the next. They could not know what the future held, but they had something every successful generation before them had possessed: the ability to respond, to change what they did when circumstances changed around them. That ability would matter enormously, because beneath the apparently stable world they inhabited, the Earth was storing an energy that had been building for thousands of years, and somewhere beneath northern Sumatra, a geological giant was waiting. 74,000 years ago, Earth was not an empty wilderness. It was alive. Forests, grasslands, rivers, lakes, coastlines, animals, plants, and human communities spread across parts of Africa and Eurasia. The exact landscapes were different from those we know today. Climate changed, sea levels changed, habitats shifted, but to the people living within them, the world was simply home. They knew where water could be found, where food appeared, where shelter could be made, where familiar animals moved through the landscape. The world around them may have seemed permanent, but it was not. Our planet has never truly been still. Climate changes, continents move, rivers change course, ice advances and retreats, volcanoes sleep. Sometimes for thousands of years. And beneath one mountain in Sumatra, something enormous was happening. Deep underground, magma accumulated beneath immense pressure. For thousands of years, the system remained hidden, invisible to the people living above it, until eventually, the Earth changed. Then, it happened. In what is now northern Sumatra, a colossal volcanic system erupted. The Toba eruption was one of the largest known eruptions of the Quaternary period. It released enormous quantities of volcanic material. Ash and gases rose high into the atmosphere. The landscape around the eruption was transformed, and material from the eruption traveled far beyond Indonesia. Thousands of kilometers away, microscopic traces of that event were eventually buried in sediments. Today, those layers give scientists something extraordinary: a timestamp, a geological fingerprint, evidence that an event of immense scale really happened. But knowing that Toba erupted is only the beginning. The harder question is what came next. What happened to the climate? What happened to ecosystems? And most importantly, what happened to the humans who were alive when the sky changed? For decades, one explanation became especially influential. Perhaps the eruption had triggered a severe climatic shock. Perhaps that shock had reduced food supplies. Perhaps human populations had collapsed. And perhaps the consequences of that collapse were still visible in our DNA. It was an extraordinary hypothesis, and for a time, it seemed to connect several mysteries at once. But a beautiful explanation is not necessarily a correct one. Science has to test it, and that is where our story truly begins. Before the eruption, life continued. The sun rose. People moved through familiar landscapes. Children played. Adults searched for food. Groups traveled between resources. The seasons changed, and beneath all of it, the volcanic system at Toba was approaching its catastrophic release. We should be careful here. The ancient people living thousands of kilometers away had no way of knowing what was happening beneath Sumatra. There was no satellite watching the volcano, no seismological network, no warning system, no written record. There was simply a world that appeared stable, until suddenly it wasn't. The enormous geological forces beneath the surface were invisible, but their consequences would not be. The eruption itself belongs to a scale almost difficult to imagine. A vast quantity of volcanic material was expelled. Ash and gases entered the atmosphere. The eruption excavated and reshaped the landscape around Toba. And unlike a small volcanic eruption, this event left evidence over an extraordinary geographic range. Its ash became a marker, a layer in the geological record, a line separating one moment in Earth's history from another. But the word supereruption can create the wrong mental image. The most important question is not how dramatic the eruption looked. It is what the atmosphere and ecosystems did afterward, because volcanoes can influence climate. Particles and gases injected high into the atmosphere can alter how much sunlight reaches Earth's surface. And that possibility gave scientists a second part of the puzzle: the climate. Volcanic ash does not behave exactly like smoke from an ordinary fire. Fine particles can be carried by atmospheric circulation, and the geological record shows that Toba's eruption left a widespread ash signature across parts of Asia. Today, scientists can identify that signature. They can compare its chemistry, its mineral composition, its position within sediments, and its age. The ash tells us the eruption happened, but ash alone cannot tell us exactly what every ecosystem experienced afterward. That requires another kind of evidence: climate records, lake sediments, ice cores, pollen, charcoal, plant remains, computer models, and archaeological sites. The question becomes much harder. How much did the eruption alter the climate? Where? For how long? And how severe were those changes? Because a global eruption does not necessarily produce a uniform global response. Different regions have different climates, different ecosystems, different water supplies, different food sources, and different human populations. That distinction would become critical. The idea was simple. If a gigantic eruption injected enough material into the atmosphere, sunlight could be reduced, temperatures could fall, growing conditions could deteriorate, food webs could be disrupted, and human populations could suffer. This became part of what is commonly called the Toba catastrophe hypothesis. The hypothesis was powerful because it seemed to connect several observations. A huge eruption, a period of climatic instability, and evidence that human populations had experienced changes in genetic diversity. But there was a problem. The strength of the story depended on several separate pieces of evidence lining up precisely, and the farther scientists looked, the less certain that alignment became. Climate models produced different results depending on assumptions about the amount and type of material injected into the atmosphere. Environmental records from different regions did not always show the same response. And archaeological evidence began raising an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe humans did not experience Toba as one worldwide catastrophe. Maybe the story was regional, uneven, and much more complicated. During the late 20th century, researchers began exploring a remarkable possibility. Could a volcanic catastrophe help explain an ancient reduction in human population size? The logic was understandable. A severe environmental shock could reduce resources. Reduced resources could increase mortality. Population decline could leave a genetic signature. And if the timing appeared to align, perhaps one event could explain several observations at once. The Toba hypothesis became one of the most dramatic interpretations of the late Pleistocene. But hypotheses are not conclusions. They are questions expressed as explanations. And explanations have to survive contact with evidence. The next clue was not buried beneath volcanic ash. It was inside us. DNA carries information inherited across generations, and population genetics can reveal clues about the history of populations. One of the striking features of human genetic variation is that our species has relatively low genetic diversity compared with some other species. That observation tells us something important. Our population history has included periods of contraction and expansion, but there is a crucial distinction. A genetic bottleneck does not automatically tell us what caused it, and it does not necessarily mean that only a tiny number of human beings were physically alive. Population genetics often describes effective population size, a measure related to how many individuals contribute genetically to future generations. That number can differ dramatically from the actual number of people alive. So the DNA raised an important question. Human populations had experienced demographic changes. But when did they happen? How severe were they? And what caused them? Could Toba have been responsible? Or was the apparent coincidence misleading us? Scientists call a sharp reduction in population size a bottleneck. Imagine a large population entering a period in which only a fraction of its genetic variation contributes to later generations. The descendants inherit a reduced sample of the earlier diversity. But reconstructing such an event tens of thousands of years later is extraordinarily difficult. Genetic signals can be shaped by population structure, migration, isolation, natural selection, population expansion, and other demographic events. Different models can therefore produce different histories. This matters because the popular version of the Toba story sometimes turns a complicated genetic inference into a simple sentence: humanity nearly went extinct. That is much stronger than the evidence allows us to say. The genetic evidence tells us that our species has a complex demographic history. It does not, by itself, prove that Toba caused a near-extinction event, and that distinction would become increasingly important. For a while, the story looked beautifully simple: a gigantic eruption, a dramatic climatic response, a reduction in resources. How human population bottleneck. One event, one explanation. But nature rarely behaves so neatly. While geneticists were studying DNA, archaeologists were excavating ancient landscapes. Geologists were tracing volcanic ash. Paleoclimatologists were studying environmental archives. And each discipline was producing another piece of evidence. The question was no longer whether Toba had erupted. That was established. The question was whether the eruption had produced the enormous human catastrophe that the hypothesis predicted. And now, the ground itself was beginning to answer. The first major challenge did not arrive as one spectacular discovery. It accumulated slowly. A site here, a sediment core there, a genetic analysis, a climate reconstruction. Each piece was small, but together, they began to complicate the story. If Toba had nearly erased humanity, we might expect archaeological evidence of severe disruption, but archaeology does not always preserve catastrophe clearly. People leave uneven traces, sites disappear, sediments erode, tools are reused, populations move, and therefore every apparent continuity must be examined carefully. The evidence was not saying Toba had no effect. It was asking a subtler question. How large was that effect, and where did it occur? One of the most important archaeological regions in this debate is Jwalapuram in southern India. Here, researchers identified stone tool-bearing deposits associated with the Toba ash horizon. The remarkable observation was not simply that tools existed beneath the ash. It was that archaeological evidence continued above the Toba layer as well. That raised an important possibility. People may have survived the eruption and continued occupying the region, but we have to be precise. A stone tool above an ash layer does not automatically prove that the same population survived continuously. Archaeological interpretation requires dating, stratigraphy, technology, and context. What the evidence does show is that the simplistic picture of a devastated landscape followed by total human disappearance is difficult to sustain. The archaeological record was refusing to become a clean extinction line, and that was a problem for the simplest version of the hypothesis. Thousands of kilometers away, another archive was waiting. Lake Malawi. Year after year, season after season, particles settled onto the lake floor. Plant remains accumulated, charcoal accumulated, minerals accumulated, and over immense periods of time, those layers formed a natural archive. Scientists can extract sediment cores and read that archive. Near the time corresponding to the Toba eruption, researchers found evidence of environmental change. But they did not find the kind of catastrophic ecological collapse predicted by the strongest Toba catastrophe scenarios. The record showed variability. It showed changes in vegetation and fire, but it did not provide convincing evidence for a prolonged volcanic winter, devastating East African ecosystems. That finding mattered, because if the climatic impact was not uniform, then human populations could not be assumed to have experienced one uniform disaster either. Then there was another possibility. Maybe survival was partly about where people lived. At Pinnacle Point in South Africa, Archaeological evidence shows that humans exploited coastal resources during the Middle Stone Age. Marine foods could provide calories in environments where some terrestrial resources became unreliable. Shellfish, coastal plants, other marine resources. The evidence also shows technological sophistication and complex environmental knowledge. This does not mean the coast was a magical refuge. It does not mean everyone survived because they lived beside the sea. But it demonstrates something fundamental. Human populations occupied different environments, and those environments did not respond identically to climatic change. A community living beside a productive coastline could face a very different set of problems from a community living deep inland. Survival, therefore, may have depended partly on flexibility, where people lived, what they ate, what they knew, what they could change, and how quickly they could adapt. Now the evidence was becoming difficult to ignore. The eruption was real. The ash was real. Human populations experienced demographic change. That is real too. But the connection between those facts was no longer straightforward. Genetics could indicate an ancient bottleneck. Archaeology could show continuity. Environmental records could show regional differences. Climate models could produce different outcomes depending on assumptions. None of these disciplines had necessarily failed. They were measuring different things, at different scales, with different uncertainties. The original theory had offered a single dramatic explanation. The evidence was demanding something more complicated, and that is one of the defining moments in science. When a theory stops being an answer and becomes a question. By now, scientists were no longer asking, did Toba erupt? Everyone agreed that it did. The real question had changed. How much did it actually affect human populations? Did different regions experience different environmental consequences? Did some communities suffer severe disruption while others experienced relatively little? Did climate change contribute to population changes independently of the eruption? Could migration and isolation explain part of the genetic pattern? And how much of what we see in DNA can actually be connected to one event 74,000 years ago? The answers would not come from one artifact, one laboratory, or one model. They would come from bringing the evidence together. The volcano had become the beginning of the investigation, not the end. Scientists faced an uncomfortable problem. The evidence did not tell one perfectly unified story. Genetics suggested ancient demographic complexity. Archaeology suggested survival and continuity in some regions. Geology confirmed the enormous eruption. Climate archives suggested regional variability. At first, that disagreement might look like failure, but it isn't. Imagine 4 witnesses describing the same event. One remembers the sound, another remembers the landscape, another remembers what happened to the people, another remembers what happened afterward. Their stories may differ, without any of them being completely wrong. Science works the same way. Different evidence records different aspects of the past. The task is not to force them into agreement. It is to understand why they differ. Human watched the Toba eruption and wrote down what happened. There is no diary, no photograph, no eyewitness account. Everything must be reconstructed from physical evidence: volcanic ash, sediment, pollen, charcoal, plant remains, ice records, marine deposits, archaeological sites, genetic variation, and mathematical models. Each is a fragment. Together, they allow scientists to reconstruct possibilities. But reconstruction is not time travel. It contains uncertainty. Models depend on assumptions. Sediments can be disturbed. Archaeological sites can be incomplete. Genetic histories can have multiple plausible explanations. The goal is therefore not to produce a perfect picture. It is to narrow the range of possible histories, and with every new dataset, that range can change. One assumption had quietly shaped the original catastrophe narrative, that humanity experienced Toba as one population. But our ancestors were not living in one place. They were dispersed across different environments. Some lived inland, some lived near coasts, some moved across landscapes. Some populations were isolated, others interacted. Climate affected those places differently. Food availability differed, water availability differed, shelter differed, and so did the ability to adapt. Some communities may have suffered severely, others may have experienced more modest environmental change. Others may have moved. Others may have relied on resources that became especially valuable during difficult periods. The story of human survival was never the story of one group. It was the story of many populations, living different lives, under different conditions. That brings us back to DNA. If Toba alone cannot confidently explain the bottleneck, then what can? The answer may not be one event. Population histories can be shaped by combinations of forces, climate changes, migration, isolation, population expansion, natural selection, founder effects, competition, and demographic changes unfolding over thousands of years. This is less satisfying than a single dramatic explanation, but science is not supposed to choose the most satisfying story. It is supposed to choose the explanation that survives the evidence. Perhaps the ancient genetic bottleneck was real. Perhaps it reflects several demographic processes. Perhaps climate played a role. Perhaps different populations experienced different histories. And perhaps the apparent bottleneck cannot be assigned to one volcano with the confidence once imagined. To some people, changing a scientific conclusion can look like weakness. But changing a conclusion when evidence changes is one of science's greatest strengths. Ideas are proposed, tested, questioned, refined, sometimes rejected, sometimes revived in modified form. A hypothesis is not sacred. It is provisional. The Toba story is a perfect example. A dramatic explanation inspired decades of research. That research produced new evidence. The new evidence complicated the explanation, and the complication produced better questions. Science did not become less interesting because the original catastrophe story weakened. It became more interesting because now there was a harder problem to solve. Not simply what happened, but how can we know what happened when almost all the witnesses are gone? By now, the mystery had changed. The question was no longer, did Toba erupt? It was, how did early humans survive a world that was constantly changing? The volcano was one chapter. The climate was another. Migration was another. Technology, food, cooperation, isolation, population change, adaptation. The real story was becoming much larger than one eruption, and perhaps that was the most important discovery. The survival of humanity may not have depended on surviving one catastrophe. It may have depended on something more fundamental, the ability to keep changing. After decades of research, some things are remarkably secure. Around 74,000 years ago, an enormous eruption occurred at Toba in what is now Indonesia. The eruption left ash deposits that can still be identified across large parts of Asia. Scientists can study those deposits today. We also know that human populations underwent complex demographic changes during the late Pleistocene. And we know that the climate of this period was unstable. These are foundations. But foundations are not the whole building. The more difficult question is how these events were connected, and that is where certainty gives way to investigation. Did Toba directly cause the human genetic bottleneck? The evidence does not allow us to say that with confidence. Did the eruption affect climate? Almost certainly. But did every region experience the same effect? No reason to assume so. Did some populations suffer more than others? Very likely. Did some populations adapt or migrate? The archaeological record strongly suggests that human populations were capable of both movement and adaptation. Exactly how many people survived Toba, we do not know, and we may never know. That is not a failure of science. It is a consequence of deep time. Most people who lived through these events left no written record. Many left no obvious archaeological trace. Their bones may have disappeared. Their camps may have been eroded. Their tools may never be found. The past does not preserve everything. Science can only work with what survives. Today, the Toba story is much more nuanced than the popular near-extinction narrative suggests. The eruption remains one of the most extraordinary volcanic events known. Its environmental consequences remain scientifically important. But many researchers no longer treat it as a simple explanation for humanity's demographic history. Instead, the evidence points toward a larger system: climate, migration, population structure, isolation, technology, resource availability, selection, and adaptation. The eruption may have mattered. In some places, it may have mattered considerably, but there is little reason to assume that one event acted on every human population in exactly the same way. Nature almost never does. And perhaps, the most remarkable discovery was not about the volcano at all. It was about us. Human beings have repeatedly encountered environmental challenges: cold, heat, drought, changing coastlines, scarcity, disease, predators, competition, and uncertainty. Yet our species persisted, not because humans were physically unbeatable. We weren't. Not because we were the fastest. We weren't. Not because we controlled nature. We never have. We survived because we could learn, because knowledge could be shared, because tools could improve, because strategies could change, because people could cooperate, because one generation could learn something and pass that knowledge to the next. That capacity may have been one of the most important advantages our species ever developed. Long before writing, long before cities, long before agriculture, humans were already learning from one another and carrying that knowledge forward. So, did one volcano nearly wipe out humanity? The most honest answer is, we don't know. What we do know is more interesting than a simple yes or no. Toba was real. The eruption was enormous. Its environmental effects were real. Human populations experienced demographic change, but the evidence does not establish that Toba alone nearly erased our species. Instead, the investigation has revealed something more complicated. Human history cannot be reduced to one disaster. Our story is made from countless interactions between people and environments. Climate, movement, technology, competition, cooperation, chance, and adaptation. The volcano did not provide the final answer. It forced scientists to ask better questions, and sometimes, that is what the greatest scientific discoveries do. They do not close a mystery. They teach us how to investigate it. The next time you look in the mirror, remember this. Your story did not begin with you. It did not begin with your parents or your grandparents. It reaches backward, across thousands of generations, across continents, across changing climates, across landscapes that no longer exist. Every person alive today is the product of an extraordinary chain of survival, not a chain without breaks, not a story without extinction, but a lineage that continued again and again and again. The people at the beginning of that chain never knew your name. They never imagined your world. They could not have pictured cities, satellites, computers, hospitals, or spacecraft. But their lives created the possibility of yours. We will never know the names of most of the people who lived through the late Pleistocene. We do not know every language they spoke, every place they traveled, every meal they shared, every fear they carried, every person they loved. Their individual stories are mostly gone, but traces remain. A stone tool, a shell, a hearth, a layer of sediment, a fragment of DNA, a footprint, a genetic pattern passed through thousands of generations. These fragments are incomplete, but together, they tell us something profound. Human beings were not passive observers of environmental change. They responded, they moved, they learned, they experimented, they adapted, and the descendants of those populations eventually became the people of today. There is no single heroic ancestor we can point to. There were millions of ordinary lives, most forgotten, but collectively, they carried the story forward. Perhaps the greatest discovery was not that Toba nearly changed humanity. Perhaps it was discovering how difficult it is to explain humanity with a single event. Every excavation adds something. Every sediment core adds something. Every genetic sequence adds something. Every climate reconstruction changes the picture slightly. The puzzle is still being assembled, and that is not a weakness. It is the nature of history. The past is not sitting intact somewhere waiting to be opened. It has been scattered, buried, broken, erased, preserved in unexpected places. Scientists recover fragments, test them, compare them, and sometimes discover that yesterday's explanation no longer works. That is how knowledge advances, not by pretending we already know everything, but by becoming better at recognizing what we don't know. For roughly 300,000 years, our species has been moving through an uncertain world. Every generation inherited problems from the one before it, and every generation added something of its own. A new tool, a new route, a new technique, a new story. A new way of organizing life. The people alive 74,000 years ago could never have imagined us. They could not have imagined the world we built, and yet, their future became our present, which means something else. Our future belongs to people who do not exist yet. Children who have not been born. Generations whose problems we cannot predict. Technologies we cannot imagine. Landscapes we cannot foresee. Their world will depend partly on what we learn now. The chain is still moving. We are not the end of the story. We are another chapter. Maybe the most important question was never, did one volcano nearly wipe out humanity? Maybe the real question is, what does it take for a species to survive? Not once, not for a single generation, but again and again, across hundreds of thousands of years. The answer may not be written entirely in volcanic ash, or hidden inside ancient DNA, or preserved perfectly beneath the earth. It may be found in the pattern that appears again and again across human history. When circumstances changed, we changed. When resources moved, we moved. When old strategies failed, we learned new ones. When one environment became difficult, we searched for another. And when knowledge proved useful, we passed it forward. That does not make humanity invincible. It never has. Our species remains vulnerable to forces far larger than any individual. Climate, disease, environmental change, conflict, and events we cannot predict. But the story of the past gives us something more valuable than a guarantee. It gives us perspective. 74,000 years ago, humans lived beneath a sky they could not understand. They could not know what was happening thousands of kilometers away. They could not know whether their descendants would exist. They could not know that one day scientists would recover traces of their world and use those traces to ask whether humanity had nearly disappeared. They simply lived. They adapted. They raised the next generation. And somehow, the chain continued until it reached us. So when you look around at the world today, remember how improbable that is. Every human being alive is part of a story built from countless acts of survival. Not one miracle, not one volcano, not one heroic moment, but millions upon millions of ordinary decisions made by people whose names have vanished. People who found food, people who moved, people who shared, people who learned, people who protected children, people who endured uncertainty, people who survived long enough for another generation to begin, and then another, and another, until eventually there was us. Humanity is still here, the story is still being written, and perhaps that is the most remarkable fact of all. Beyond Facts with Jay, where curiosity becomes understanding.